Hi everyone. We are starting on our new unit and it is going to be on literary critical lenses. Um, these critical lenses are basically ways in which we can analyze literature. As you can see here, we're really only looking at six, but there are more critical lenses than the ones that we're going to look at in this unit. So we're going to just look at some of the more um, easier to understand ones and ones that you may already recognize that you already use when you read literature. So, the definition of literary and critical lens theory is that there are various approaches, or they're kind of like a magnifying glass with lenses like glasses, where scholars are really using to analyze literature. Criticism in this case means that it's an investigation, kind of like a detective looking for clues. It's an evaluation, it's an analysis of a literary text. So these critical lens, eventually, they're going to help us figure out how to create literary analysis and to interpret the literature in various ways and methods. So the first critical lens we're looking at is psychoanalytic lens. And this type of criticism is all about looking at the mind and the subconscious, because that's what psychology is all about. The mind, mental health, the subconscious. And when we're looking at these things, we're not just looking at the characters within the piece of literature, but also the author and the readers as well, when they're writing and when they're interpreting the text. So the idea of psychoanalysis comes from Sigmund Freud. A lot of people have disproved some of the things that he um, kind of threw out as theories, um, but a lot of what he has said has already influenced the way we approach things like dreams and the idea that we have an unconscious, or sometimes people call it the subconscious. So the idea of the unconscious is that it motivates a lot of our behaviors. And it's because there are some base parts of our unconscious that we're not aware of. These are desires, their fears, their needs, and conflicts. And they're highly influenced by childhood events. So, kind of think about watching movies and things like that, in which people are really traumatized by things that happened in their childhood with how their mothers or their fathers approached their discipline. Um, and in talking about the unconscious, we also talk about how people keep those conflicts or those desires, fears, and needs in check. So people use selective perception, selective memory, denial, displacement, projection, regression, fear of intimacy, and fear of death. These are ways that our mind just uses to kind of either forget some of the things that have happened to us in the past or in our childhood, or we look at something else instead of those memories, or instead of trying to remember those memories. One of the important things to keep in mind when you're doing psychoanalysis is considering the areas of the mind, those Freudian areas of the mind that kind of control or lets go of our unconscious and our desires. So the id is kind of like the carnal animalistic part of us. That's the area of the mind that's home to selfish desires and base drives. The ego is the area of the mind that is home of the defenses, and it basically keeps the id in check so that you don't run around just trying to fulfill every desire that jumps into your head. The superego is kind of like the really goody goody two shoes of your mind. And it's the part of your mind that's home to judgment of yourself and others. So that superego, um, because it's so judgmental, is that I always try to remind you that you're part of a society and you have morals, and you can't just fulfill everything that you want to do, that come into your id. One additional thing that psychoanalysts are very obsessed by is this sexual desire that people have, that is called the Oedipus complex. And it's basically about children's need for their parents' attention, and then how children, sort of as they grow up, they see that their mothers are um, diverting their attention and paying more attention to their father instead of the children. And then the children, they get jealous of that, and that somehow translates to sexual development. So if you think about like Oedipus Rex, the story, the play was sort of all about how Oedipus grows up apart from his father and mother. And when he returns to his hometown, not knowing his father and mother, he is um, immediately driven by the his id, to kill his father, not knowing that it's his father, and then to marry his mother. Here are a bunch of questions to ask yourself when you're looking at the psychoanalytic theory, or the psychoanalytic lens. And answering some of these questions will help you kind of figure out the way to interpret the story through psychoanalysis. So looking at various dream scenes, images, what things might symbolize, if there are any sexual or desires or fear of death. Those are some images that psychoanalysts are really driven by. And then looking at those hidden meanings as well. The reader response criticism is fairly easy to understand. It's basically all about the focus on the reader and the reader's interpretation of the story and its themes. And basically it kind of takes this idea of, well, you can't really separate the text from the reader. The reader is, because the author isn't around, the reader is going to interpret the story however they want to. And so they really only have the story and the text itself to decide what the text means. In order to do reader response theory, you really also have to look at other lenses. It points to you using other lenses to make your interpretation. So maybe something like psychoanalytic or feminist lens. The role of the reader cannot be omitted from the understanding of literature. Again, it's the author isn't there to interpret the entire story for the reader, so the reader is on the reader to actively create the meaning that they find in that piece of literature. And then here's a bunch of questions. You might want to pause here so you can write some of these questions down. It's all about how the reader interacts with the text, looking at just the basic sounds and the shapes of the words and how the reader sounds it out or views them. And then what various people, how various people have interpreted the text and how that contrasts and compared to one another. Feminist criticism is a critical lens that looks specifically at female characters, gender roles, and even the author, him or herself, and their notions of what gender roles are and how it comes across in their writing. It's feminist theories here in this case come with some very basic ideas that all feminists kind of prescribe to. And this is the idea that the patriarchy is oppressive. Women are seen as the other, they're seen as marginalized, and they are often seen by how they differ from those male norms and values. And then culture really drives the way we view gender and the difference between masculinity and femininity. And then seeing how all the feminist activity will ultimately lead to gender equality. When we're looking at feminist movements, there were really three waves of movements. The first wave was the suffrage movement, which is all about the women's vote in America, and gaining that vote in 1920 in an amendment. Second wave feminism happened in conjunction with the civil rights movement. So we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, and basically fighting for equal working conditions, especially as more and more women start leaving the home and working outside of the home. Third wave feminism is sort of present day, and it examines intersectional feminism. So the idea that feminism isn't just about gender. When you're looking at gender equality, you also have to look at equality of the races, equality of the classes, and things like that. Here are the typical questions that the feminist theory critical lens asks when they're working with the text. So looking at the relationship between men and women, the characters, and also the author, and maybe even the way that the reader interprets the story, whether they find it empowering or oppressive, the ideas within it. So again, you might want to pause here so you can write some of these down. New historicism is something that we tend to do a lot in English class. So what we're really looking at is the historical and social context of the piece of literature, especially during the time in which it was written. So whenever in literature class or in English class, your English teacher, starts the unit off with giving you a lot of that background information about that time period. Well, in that case, we're really looking at social and historical context, and that's very new historicism. It's basically kind of the accepting of the idea that history is never objective because someone is always telling us how it happened, and that person is biased. So history is always interpreted and it's always subjective. So every piece of work in that case, it can tell us how people interpret events that happened in history when the work was written. Here are some of the typical questions that new historicists would ask when they are analyzing a piece of literature. So again, looking at the event, looking how those events criticize or support or condemn, or how the work has supported or condemned that event, or political figures or movements of their time, looking at marginalized populations, looking at how the words that are used in the text, how they may have changed meaning over time. Marxist criticism is, as you can tell from the name of it, is all about Karl Marx, and he was the person who wrote the Communist Manifesto. So, of course, it's kind of looking at the influences of a capitalist society and in class differences. Karl Marx was a German revolutionary, and he came up with the idea of socialism. And always the question that is being asked is, who benefits from this work, or who benefits from this law? Things like that. So it talks about he often talks about how the lower and working classes are oppressed, and because they're so often oppressed, they are going to want to overthrow the people who are above them, the upper middle classes or the elite classes, and eventually that overthrowing will lead that rebellion will lead to intellectuals being able to create an equal society where everyone owns everything. That is the base idea of socialism. The material dialectic is about how material realities of society is what drives historical change. So people are really concerned by economic rather than some of the ideals that people say they care about. Here are the questions that Marxist theorists would ask when they're interpreting a piece of literature. So looking at the social class of the author, of the characters, and how those social classes are represented and how they provide a conflict within the story.